108 years ago, the Bolshevik Party, led by Vladimir Lenin and Leon Trotsky, seized power at the head of the Russian workers and peasantry, overthrowing the capitalists, the bankers, and the landlords of Russia for the first time in history, establishing a revolutionary state where ordinary people took control over their own destinies and held on to power. In the speech that follows, Alan Woods, the political secretary for the Revolutionary Communist International, talks about the legacy of Lenin, the legacy of the Russian Revolution, the reason that revolutionaries today continue to be inspired by these great events and Lenin's achievements, how the bureaucracy of the Soviet Union around Stalin tragically betrayed Lenin's legacy and eventually paved the road to the restoration of capitalism in Russia. In spite of this, the hatred that the capitalists and their lackeys continue to express towards Lenin and the revolution over 100 years after Lenin died betrays their fear that the events of October 1917 will one day be repeated on an even higher level in all the countries of the world. Alan originally delivered this address to launch a new two-part biography of Lenin, which he co-wrote with Rob Sewell, the leader of the Revolutionary Communist Party in Britain, in the Russian language. And while this speech was delivered to online participants in the launch event, we think that it's excellent and full of lessons and deserves a wider audience, which is why we're making it available to you. The first part of the speech is in Russian, which we've taken the liberty of subtitling into English. All right, that's all from me. Without further ado, here's Alan Woods.
Много лет тому назад когда я был молодым аспирантом в МГУ в Москве, я довольно неплохо говорил по-русски. Но это было давным-давно, я уже стар. И правду истину сказать, я очень не хочу оскорблять красивый язык Пушкина и Толстого. И поэтому сегодня, к сожалению, я буду говорить по-английски. Может быть, в следующий раз я буду говорить по-русски. Ну, увидим. Ну, давай начнем на английском. When the famous Scottish historian of the 19th century, Thomas Carlyle, was writing a book about the English revolutionary leader Oliver Cromwell, he said that before he could begin to write, he first had to rescue the Cromwell from under a mountain of dead dogs, slanders and calumnies and so on against Cromwell. That was hundreds of years ago, that the bourgeoisie couldn't even forgive the leader of the revolution in England. And today, of course, anyone that writes a biography of Lenin, as Rob and myself attempted to do, were faced, in fact, with exactly the same task that faced Thomas Carlyle. Because for decades now, the memory of Vladimir Ilyich Lenin has been, in fact, buried under a heap of slander, lies, and calumnies of the most disgraceful and scandalous sort. Now, why is Lenin, why is this man so hated by the enemies of socialism? Well, it's precisely because his name is intimately associated, more than anyone else, with the October Revolution and the creation of the Bolshevik Party. Now, for us, for the communists, the October Revolution in Russia, let's spell it out, was the greatest single event in the whole of human history. Now, why do I say this? Well, because for the first time here, if we exclude the short but tragic experience of the Paris Commune, for the first time, the working people, the ordinary working men and women, overthrew the old hated regime of tyranny and oppression, and at least began the task, the great historical task of the socialist transformation of society. I say they began the task, they couldn't complete it because in a backward country like Russia, the material conditions for building socialism were frankly absent. But that's another discussion we could perhaps return to in the future. For us, it was a wonderful thing. It was, in fact, I know myself, when I was in Russia, by the way, at the time, this was at the time of Brezhnev, the Soviet Union, 1970 to be exact, I actually spoke to people that had participated in this great revolution. And you could see written in their faces, I could see the enormous inspirational effect that this revolution had, uplifting effect that it had. There's an old woman who said to me, she said, "You can't imagine what this was like. You can't imagine," he said. Какой подъем, she said. A great spiritual uplift, which brought to the surface all the living forces of Russia, living forces of Russian society. Not just the workers and the peasants, but also the intellectuals, the best, the most thinking sections of society, rallied to this great cause. It was like a dream, of course. Yes, but for the bourgeoisie, for the representatives of the old, vicious, oppressive regime, this was not a dream, it was a nightmare, the worst nightmare. And to this day, believe it or not, so many decades later, 100 years later, the Russian Revolution still remains, the October Revolution still remains a nightmare. And you see, behind this hatred, they have an absolute hatred. You can see this in all the writings of these so-called historians. I mean, worthless people, worthless historians. They're not worthless. As serious people, as serious historians, they're frankly not worth reading. None of them. Yeah, but you see, in every line, it's dripping with hatred, spite, and malice towards Lenin and Trotsky, of course, the two men that really were the leaders of this, the undisputed leaders of the October Revolution. There's hatred. Yes, but if you think about it, if you look deeply into the question, behind this hatred, there's another thing, isn't there? There's something else, and that's fear. Colossal, blind, unmitigated fear. And there's a fear. You see, what they fear is not the Russian Revolution that took place 100 years ago. They don't regard this as past history. Neither do we. We regard it as a living experience. We regard it not as the past, but of the present and the future of humankind, as a matter of fact. And our enemies see it in exactly the same way. They do not see the Russian Revolution as ancient history, as prehistory, like Egyptian mummies that you find in a museum. Oh, no. It is their greatest nightmare, and they're terrified that this shows their future. So behind the hatred, there's fear, absolute, unbridled, blind fear. And this fear, by the way, is not without foundation. It's well-founded. It's founded precisely in the conditions that exist today under capitalism. Perhaps I will return to that later on. But it's this fear, you see, that precisely motivates, it explains the significance of the October Revolution and the necessity, the burningness and the urgent necessity that they have to destroy the memory of the Russian Revolution completely and to blacken the memory of its leaders, especially Lenin and of course also Trotsky. And this is the real reason for the enormous number of books. I mean, work it out, think about it. If Marxism is really dead, as they continually tell us, if communism is dead, as they say, if the Russian Revolution was a complete waste of time and of no interest, then of course it would be of no interest. If it was irrelevant, it would have no interest, would it? So why would they write all these colossal number of books that they churn out like sausages from a sausage machine? Every year, every month, every week practically, days are churned out that only have one aim: to blacken the name of the Russian Revolution and to blacken the name of Lenin. And this, of course, is not an accident. It's owing to the fact, as I've said, that Lenin, above all, the name of Lenin is associated with the fact that he was the main moving force the inspiration, the creator, if you like, of the Bolshevik Party throughout its history, and above all, the architect, together with Trotsky, it must be said, the architect of the great victory of the October Revolution itself. And this is what makes him a target, a necessary target for the hatred and spite and malice of all these defenders of capitalism. Now, they have to do this. They have to bury, for example, they must deny, they systematically deny all of the achievements of the Russian Revolution, the greatest event in human history, as I said, and of the Soviet Union, which came out of the experience of the revolution. And therefore, this was a signal for an avalanche of lies against all the colossal achievements. What achievements are we referring to here? Let's spell it out. The Russian Revolution of 1970, the October Revolution, the Great October Revolution, represented a colossal step forward, a colossal advance, which tore the Russian people out of the backwardness and the poverty and the muck and the dirt and the ignorance and the backwardness of 1,000 years of Tsarism and into the 20th century, into the modern age, building a colossal base in industry, in science, in technique, also colossal achievements of culture, of art, of many other things, which in the West they still continue to deny, which is entirely monstrous. This actually, if you think about it, just look at the facts and figures, which I won't state because it's not necessary. Find them easily enough. This must be the greatest social and economic and cultural transformation in the whole of human history. That's what they can't stomach. It's showed in practice, not in dialectical materials, not in theory, not in the 3 volumes of Capital, but in the language, the concrete language of iron, steel, cement, and electricity, the genuine potential of a nationalized planned economy. Without landlords, without capitalists, without bankers, all of this was achieved by the working class. That's something which they can't accept. They continually try to deny this, but you can't deny the truth. And the truth eventually will come out. Now, this was the greatest, I repeat, I insist, the October Revolution and the USSR, planned economy, which is brought, the nationalized planned economy brought out by the revolution, brought about the greatest advance of the productive forces of any country in history. And that was shown, by the way, and that's something else they deny in the most scandalous manner. It's the anniversary of the victory over fascism in the Second World War. That was the Second War, let's spell it out. The Second World War, in reality, boiled down in Europe, that is, boiled down to a gigantic conflict, a titanic conflict between Hitler's Germany, with all the resources, think of that, with all the resources of Europe behind it, and the Soviet Union, on its own. The Red Army, yes, on its own, the Red Army, with the heroism of the Soviet people rallying to the defense of the revolution against Hitler's barbarism. They alone defeated the armies. It was the most astonishing victory in history. And one of the main reasons for that, apart from the loyalty of the Soviet working class to the revolution, was, of course, the colossal advantages of a nationalized planned economy over capitalism. That was shown in practice. Although the Soviet Union suffered terrible losses, as you know, more dead and destruction than any other country except for China, that is, which is never talked about. But they recovered. They had all these losses, but they recovered very quickly on the basis precisely of the advantages of a nationalized planned economy. And very quickly they were out producing Germany in guns, in rockets, in tanks, and everything else. And in 1943, 44, 45, the Russian Red Army staged the most spectacular military advance in history. None of this is accepted. They lie. They lie in their teeth. You know, they produce films to this day, giving the impression that the whole thing, all of the Second World War, was down to John Wayne and a couple of other actors, I don't know, Clint Eastwood, whoever, who single-handedly supposedly defeated the Germans. Well, not so. It's a fairy story, like all the other fairy stories that they tell. No, you see, and what it's true that ultimately it is true that the Soviet Union failed. It collapsed. It did collapse. We're aware of this. But you see, what failed in Russia was not socialism or communism in any sense that would have been understood by Lenin, for example, or by Marx, if it comes to that. What failed in Russia was not communism, but a bureaucratic and totalitarian caricature of socialism, which, of course, is Stalinism. After the death of Lenin, the revolution, isolated under conditions of frightful backwardness, suffered a degeneration, the rise of a bureaucracy, of a privileged bureaucratic caste, led by Stalin, which actually liquidated all the genuine political and social conquests of the revolution. But all that was left under Stalin was the nationalized planned economy. But that itself was a colossal step forward, in spite of the bureaucracy. In spite of the bureaucracy, it made colossal gains. Yes, but ultimately, you see, a bureaucratic regime is not compatible with the demands of a nationalized planned economy. I can't go into this in detail. It's not the purpose of this talk. Just to say that a bureaucratic regime is in direct contradiction, actually, to the requirements of a socialist planned economy. Lenin explained many times that the movement towards socialism requires the conscious democratic control of industry, society, and the state by the proletariat, by the working class. And on the contrary, a bureaucratic regime is in contradiction to this, and therefore ultimately they can't coexist. Ultimately, the bureaucratic regime, any bureaucratic regime, is inevitably accompanied by a colossal corruption, nepotism, waste, mismanagement, and chaos. And this is a fact. When I was in Russia, the Soviet Union, there were many examples of this in the actual press itself. It's Pravda every day. Examples which I won't go into. It's a fact. And therefore, this is what undermined, Stalinism undermined, not Leninism. Stalinism undermined the nationalized planned economy and led to its collapse and the return of capitalism. Now, of course, when this occurred, I remember it very well, when this occurred, at the end of the 1980s, beginning of the 1990s, the Western bourgeois were, of course, overjoyed at this. They didn't expect it, by the way, but they were delighted. And this man, prominent intellectual, bourgeois intellectual, Francis Fukuyama, actually was proclaiming at the time that this represented the end of history. Now, you can't dispose of history as easy as that. But nevertheless, what he meant was not that history itself had ended, but that after the defeat of socialism, of communism, as he would put it, there was only one socio-economic system left, and that was capitalism. And in that sense, history had indeed finished. However, he was wrong. He's since withdrawn that theory now, but I see that he's abandoned it, although they haven't made much of a fuss about that. You see, the collapse of Stalinism was not the collapse of history, but only the first act in a great historical drama. That's the point you have to grasp. And this great historical drama is not finished. It's only the first act. And now we've passed on to the second and even more dramatic act, which is a general crisis of world capitalism. And that's what we're passing through now. And that's the point. That's the point. You see, in society, as in classical mechanics, every action, they say in mechanics, every action has an equal and opposite reaction. And that's already the case. The reaction against capitalist barbarism has already started in many countries. In many countries. You see, the beginnings is reflected in all kinds of ways. I won't, not the subject of this lecture. But in many ways, people are beginning to rebel against this dreadful, this atrocious, this oppressive system of capitalism. And of course, the arguments of the bourgeois defending capitalism and opposing capitalism have frankly become unreal. They've run out of steam. They clash with reality. And therefore, every action has an equal opposite reaction. Now there is a reaction against these ideas, and it's reflected in all countries. I've seen the statistics, it's incredible. The amount of young people that are looking for communism, that call themselves, included in the United States, by the way, millions and millions of young people now call themselves communists and are looking for the ideas of communism. That's the point. And to this new generation, the ideas of Lenin, of course, but also Marx, Engels, Lenin, and Trotsky, offer a guide and a compass which they will need in order to find a way that leads to socialism, to socialist revolution, the road of communism, if you like. And therefore, that brings me to the point of this brief lecture. The publication of this book, I have it on the table. The publication of this book, which has appeared in quite a few languages, but above all, we were delighted, Rob and I were delighted to see this in the Russian language, is a colossal achievement. It's an historical achievement. The homeland of October, I'm delighted to say, a new generation of young people who are beginning to think critically, who are beginning to examine the whole situation, and are beginning to come to the same conclusions as ourselves. And therefore, the ideas of Lenin are more relevant and necessary today than at any previous time in history, even more relevant than in 1917, as a matter on a world scale. And Vladimir Ilyich Lenin is not some fossilized corpse. So, by the way, I should mention the fact that anyone who wishes to understand the real ideas of Lenin, of course, you won't find that in the rubbish which is produced by the enemies of communism in the West. That's obvious. But neither will you find it in the mountain of rubbish, I can't think of any other word, produced in the Soviet Union by the Stalinists, who really have monstrously distorted and lied about the ideas and the genuine principles of Lenin. Ever since Lenin was murdered, was assassinated, probably, let's rephrase that. Ever since Lenin died in 1924, what did they do? They embalmed his body and they turned it into a mummy. They mummified Lenin. Not only did they mummify Lenin's body against the protests of his widow, by the way, of Krupskaya, who energetically, vigorously, strongly protested against this act. She said, and I quote, in his life, when Vladimir Ilyich was alive, he was always against icons. Well, they've turned him into an icon, and that's the truth. That's what these gangsters did. They needed to do this. They couldn't oppose Lenin openly. No. Because they were usurpers. They were usurping power in the Soviet Union. They were seizing power behind the backs of the working class. But they had to use the name of Lenin, the name of communism, the name of the revolution, the name of October, concealing the reality, the monstrous reality, that what they were carrying out was a political revolution against Bolshevism, against Leninism. It's a monstrous fact that Stalin actually murdered the entire Central Committee of Lenin's party. That's a fact. All of Lenin's main collaborators and supporters, Zinoviev, Kamenev, Bukharin, Radek, a whole lot of them were, Rakovsky, they were all murdered. And hundreds of thousands of communists were sent to concentration camps where also they were murdered or they died. And finally, of course, Trotsky himself, the second great architect of the party which used to be known in 1917, by the way, is the party of Lenin and Trotsky. That's how it was known. But in any case, Trotsky was murdered by Stalin in Mexico, as you know, in 1940. But this was an actual counter-revolution against Bolshevism. That's all. And therefore, all the books that were produced at that time were a complete distortion of Lenin's ideas. You know, they turned him into an icon and built all these statues and pictures and all the rest of it. But as far as the ideas were concerned, they trampled the ideas of Lenin underfoot. They destroyed all the democratic principles of Leninism all of its internationalism, that was also scandalously destroyed by Stalin and the Stalinists. And therefore, our task is to cut across all this mythology, all this nonsense, all these lies and slanders and so on, to try to get at the real truth. We tried to do this, Rob and I, went through all of the collected works of Lenin, produced the necessary material. You'll find there a wealth of material, which is extraordinarily valuable and interesting and so on. And therefore, for us, Vladimir Ilyich Lenin is not an icon, is not a mummified body in the museum. By the way, we were against the setting up of that museum, but we're equally opposed. I must make this clear in case there's any doubt. We will be radically opposed today to any attempt to remove it, because that would be a further step in the direction of capitalism, which we're not in favor of course. But nevertheless, for us, Vladimir Ilyich Lenin is not an icon, is not a fossil, is not a mummified body in a museum. He's a genuine and vital rallying point for all of the genuine revolutionary forces of the planet, and above all in Russia itself. Unfortunately, you see there is, of course, a so-called Communist Party in Russia. I'm aware of the fact. I'll say this about that. Look, if the Russian Communist Party, the Russian Communist Party of the Russian Federation was a genuine Communist Party, there'd be no problem. Russia today could be on the eve of a new revolution, of a new edition of the October Revolution. A long time ago, that could have been the case, actually. If Zyuganov and co were genuine communists, which they are not. They have trampled again, they've trampled under all the basic principles of Leninism. And therefore, there's no hope for those people. No. The hope is with the new generation of new ideas, not new ideas in one sense, they're not new ideas at all. The old ideas, which are still absolutely valid, the ideas of Marx, Engels, Lenin, and Trotsky. I will finish with this idea. Think about this. The future October Revolution, which will come, it will come, make no doubt about it, have no doubt about it. The future October Revolution in Russia and internationally will be fought and won under the banner of Leninism. There is no other way.